Joining us now on Yahoo News on POTUS, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Olivier.
So let's talk about this. It's a year old. It's still really fascinating, still really important. A Pew Research Center poll about America's changing religious landscape. The Senate's days start with a prayer. There aren't usually a lot of people in the room when that prayer is delivered. What role does religion play in your day-to-day interactions with your colleagues?
Well, Olivier, you're right that it's a long tradition of the United States Senate that the Senate chaplain begins every legislative day with a reflection, with a prayer, with an invocation on the floor. There's also guest chaplains some days from a wide range of faith traditions. And every Wednesday morning in the Capitol, we have a group that gathers to sing, to pray, and reflect, and then to listen to one of our colleagues who stands up and delivers about a 15-minute address about the role of faith in his or her life. And I have found that to be a remarkably positive opportunity to really learn more about my colleagues, to hear about their lives, their background, their families, what moved them to try and get involved in public life, and what they value. So there is a role, I think, for religion and for faith in our life here in the Capitol. But I also think that we face an important challenge of making sure that as we craft our laws and as we conduct ourselves as elected officials, that we also remember that we're part of a pluralistic democracy where, as the Pew study shows, an increasing number of Americans have no religious affiliation or are affiliated with religions like Islam or Hinduism that are not part of the majority Judeo-Christian tradition. As long as we are legislating and conducting ourselves in a way that respects and honors the range of faiths or the choice to have no faith in our country, I'm comfortable with how we're striking that balance.
So I've been wrestling a little bit with the question of how should religion, religious values, and faith guide legislation? You know, how do you balance it? You're Presbyterian, I believe. There are some faiths that have very clear positions on matters of public policy. How do you broadly the Senate, how do you balance that? How do you balance the demands of a religion that has very clear positions with what you have to do as a senator?
Well, one of our most foundational values as a country is to celebrate, promote, recognize the free exercise of religion. We are, I think, the first country in the world to embed it in our foundational documents and to make it one of our core creeds, that there is no religious test for public service in the United States. You aren't required to be a member of the Church of England or to be Catholic or to be a particular denomination or tradition in order to be elected. In fact, that's barred in our Constitution and many of our state constitutions, probably all of them, actually. So it is something that's at the very core of who we are as a country, that we say we're celebrating and we're advancing a range of religious traditions, values, and practices. But as you point out, Olivier, there are denominations that translate the spiritual values and the religious tenets of their faith to actual policy pronouncements. And this has been an enduring challenge for the American people, where there are minority religions. For example, the Amish who refuse to serve in the military are conscientious objectors on religious grounds, or Seventh-day Adventists or Jehovah's Witnesses or Christian Scientists who have practices or views in terms of blood transfusion or vaccination that stands outside sort of majority medical practice and beliefs. Or if we have a fundamental fight, which we have been in the most recent couple of years, about abortion, about the death penalty, about the definition of marriage. This is a challenge that we've had with us since the founding of the American Republic, and that is an active and current debate now. I think we have to be mindful of the tension between civil institutions, the institutions of government to which all Americans are entitled to sort of free and equal access, and religious practice, and try to keep them in rough balance. It's a very hard balancing act, and it's one where I think it's important for me to be clear with my public, with the constituents who hired me in an election, how I strike that balance and to what extent my religious values inform my decision-making, and to keep an open mind to make sure that I'm reflecting the range of views in my state and the range of views in our country, not just advancing my own faith and my own views.
So I'll ask you one more, and then we'll bring in John. You talked about your constituents. One of the striking things about this Pew poll is the rise of the unaffiliated is very much a generational factor. Young people tend to be the ones saying they don't identify with any particular religious tradition. How does that complicate your communications with your constituents? If you come from a certain place, both generationally and religious, how do you communicate with a 25-year-old who doesn't have that as a defining part of their identity?
Well, that's a question and a challenge that I think I'm trying to confront every day. I'm trying to learn how to be better at that every day. I do a fair amount of visiting other churches or other houses of worship in my role. So whether it's visiting a synagogue or a mosque or a Hindu temple or joining fellow Christians in worship, as I do almost every Sunday, I try to make sure that I'm well grounded and in touch with the range of faith expression. But the question you're asking is, if 20 or 30% of younger Americans say they have no faith affiliation, what's that mean in terms of our communicating with each other? Well, I'm struck that a core value of millennials seems to be tolerance and inclusion. They seem to be much more comfortable than previous generations of Americans, saying that religion shouldn't dictate social policy and that civil institutions shouldn't be driven by religious or faith-based distinctions. And so I hear more and more frequently on issues about marriage and about reproductive freedom that younger Americans, particularly in my state, feel very strongly that our civil institutions and the provision of care ought to be free of religious direction. That's in real tension with what I hear from middle-aged or older generations of Delawareans. I also think how we respect each other and how we talk with each other about matters of faith is becoming more complicated, as there are more and more younger Americans who have no literacy about what the Bible means, what its core values are, and as an increasing number of Americans don't seem to understand or have any exposure to what are the principles of Judaism or of Hinduism or of Islam. I hear expressions of real concern or alarm, completely unfounded, that Islam is a religion of hate or violence, which is untrue in terms of the core teachings of Islam as a faith. Educating the average American about all the different faiths of the world and about the faiths that are dominant in our country or prevalent in our country, I think is one of our big challenges if we're going to have a constructive conversation going forward.
Hey, Senator, it's Jon Ward. How are you?
I'm great, John. Yourself?
I'm doing well, thank you. As we talk about this study, the unaffiliated group went up the most, about 7% over 7 years. Do you think there's a difference between religion and faith? And do you think there are any humans on Earth without faith of some sort? Yes,
I'm confident, having met a number of them, that there are folks I've worked with, folks who I went to school with. Let me just make sure I understand your assumptions about what faith means.
Yeah.
Folks who insist there is no God, that they know there is no higher being, that what you see is what you get, and the sort of existing human order as they see it, observable, what's in front of them, scientific principles, that is it. There is no spiritual power, there is no higher power. Yes, I have worked with and studied with and know people who are committed atheists, as opposed to agnostics, as opposed to those who believe in God but are just not sure exactly what sort of religious practices reflect that spiritual belief. If you dig deeper into this Pew study, I think there's two interesting components to it. One is that the overwhelming majority of Americans are practicing Christians, and those who are faithful Christians have actually increased the frequency with which they go to church or they read Scripture or they engage in group prayer. So one thing in this Pew study is that those who are regularly practicing faithful Christians are more committed, more devout than they had been 7 years ago. And those who self-identify as having no religious affiliation, a majority of them believe in God and have some spiritual practice, but they don't have any religious affiliation. So there's no particular denomination or church. The number of folks who say, I am convinced there is no God, there is no higher power, who are atheists, is actually a relatively small number. But yes, they're an important part of the American family, and I think we have to conduct ourselves in a way that respects not just different faiths, but the choice to have no faith.
Right. I guess what I was trying to get at was, do you think that there is a way in which atheism could be a form of faith? To me, I don't know how, just as you can't really prove there is a God, can you prove that there is not a God?
I mean, you're getting into a sort of a tautology there. If to me, to say that someone has faith means they believe in something greater than human beings.
Yeah.
That is sort of the definition of faith, in my view. Yes, you can describe atheism as a worldview. I don't believe that either is subject to scientific proof.
That's helpful. Thank you. The debate we've had over gay marriage and states like Indiana with the religious freedom law that's kind of been all over the place. How would you critique both sides of that debate? What is the religious conservative side overlooking or ignoring, and what is the LGBT rights side ignoring or overlooking?
Well, we have an institution, the both religious institution and the civil legal institution of marriage that has been fought over aggressively now for several decades in terms of whether or not it is possible to have a same-sex couple that is married under the law and that is respected and sanctified as married in different religious denominations. I think what is most missed by those who advance LGBT rights and say that, every American has a right to marry the person they love, is that there are scriptural bases and deeply held religious commitments on the part of some faith traditions that say that God ordained marriage in their religion to be an institution solely of one man and one woman. And there are deeply held religious beliefs that say that relations between the sexes, between men and between women, homosexual relations are sinful, and deeply so. And so to ask those folks to change those practices is to ask them to abandon their right to free exercise of religion. On the other hand, I think a conservative view of religion misses my belief and the belief that I think is now more broadly shared, rooted in psychology and in medicine and science, that homosexuality is not a choice. It is not a lifestyle. It is how many Americans are created, are born, and a number of religious denominations have moved towards celebrating and accepting same-sex marriages as reflecting God's will and God's creation. And then more broadly for those who do not view marriage as a religious institution, who view this as a legal and civil institution. And this is ultimately, I think, where the Supreme Court came down in their recent decision, denying Americans the right to marry the person whom they love and whom they choose, denies them access to one of the most fundamental human commitments and one of the most important ways that we form society, and something that has significant consequences in law in terms of the tax benefits and the health benefits and the rights to inheritance and to access to a loved one in the hospital and so forth. There are hundreds of ways that our legal structures and our federal government treats the married differently from the unmarried. And so it's really not possible to have civil unions be legally the equivalent of marriages. So I hope that was a quick review for you, John, of the very complicated
it's an explosive topic, and if as we talk about religion, I think one of the things that could help the debate would be more charity from probably both sides towards each other.
Well, humility and an openness towards a recognition that each side is simply trying to do this out of goodwill would be more constructive. But it's been a very heated and at times very divisive argument. So I hope and pray that it will be less so.
How often, it's Olivier again, how often do these kinds of conversations build bridges between you and your Republican colleagues versus set you apart? I mean, do you ever have debates about, say, same-sex marriage that are anchored more on the competing visions of faith and religion, and less on the competing faiths of political parties. And what is it like?
Well, I spend actually very little time with Republican Senate colleagues debating several of these sort of core divisive things like marriage equality or reproductive freedom or the death penalty or free exercise. Most of the time that I spend here with Republican colleagues is finding areas that we agree on and figuring out how we can legislate to advance those areas we agree on. And the time that we spend doing something like the prayer breakfast this morning, we tend to mostly focus on shared human concerns. When they'll lift up someone who they know who's sick or who's in danger or difficulty, we'll talk about that. Or when we talk about, we overwhelmingly tend to talk about district concerns, families that we know, or personal concerns. On the few occasions when I've had really thoughtful conversations about these topics, it has moved us forward. It's helped. So I have had a number of religious and conservative Republican colleagues sort of pull me aside, sit me down, and say, look, you seem to be a decent person. I know you went to divinity school. You seem to be, someone who shares my faith, yet I hear, because you're a Democrat, that you probably have a completely different view than me on abortion or on gay marriage. How is this possible? And in a few cases, that has produced, I think, some understanding on their part about where I'm coming from, and some better understanding on my part about how they see things. Look, all of us here in the Capitol, as senators of both parties, tend to hear in a very sort of heated way from the partisans and the advocates for the perspectives that we share on virtually any issue, from taxes to national security. And so it is helpful for us to sort of unpack and examine the rhetoric and the assumptions of the competing side. It happens more rarely than it should, but those are conversations I really welcome and value.
On that note, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, thank you so very much for this really interesting walk through faith and politics. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Olivier.